It will start with Iran. For centuries, Turkey and Iran were preeminent Islamic powers. The two are ideological enemies, but for now Turkey must sign a secret neutrality pact with Iran and agree to partition Arabia. Iran should be promised protectorate over Iraq, Yemen, and oil-rich eastern Saudi Arabia. Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Hejaz will go to Turkey. Anti-Saudi Qatar can join in too. Best time for the plan's execution is when the US loses interest in the Middle East but oil is still relevant to the global economy. Erdogan can stay in power using Putin's tactics, including but not limited to puppet presidents, extended terms, poisonings, all that fun stuff. Iran will invade first. Iraq has pro-Iranian Shia government and will allow passage. If not, Iranians can go through Kuwait by sea. The Strait of Hormuz is simultaneously blockaded. There will be international outrage at these events. Iranians effectively threaten to cut off 1/3 of the world's oil, which major powers like China and EU depend on. The West has not been friendly with Iran for decades. However, Biden's relationship with Saudi Arabia and Turkey is not much better. Recently Biden recognized Armenian genocide and withdrew support for Saudi-backed faction in Yemen. At the same time, he's considering re-entry into the Iran nuclear deal. USA is also no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil due to fracking, and Biden has no wish to drag USA into another Middle Eastern war. Both American Democrats and Republicans are sick of policing the world. So, NATO involvement in Saudi Arabia will be limited. On its own, Saudi Arabia has a huge military budget and great equipment. But the situation resembles Saddam Hussein's Iraq in 2003, poor leadership, poor morale, outnumbered, and flat land. Arab armies have rarely won wars in modern times. The Saudis will be no match to Iranians. Eastern Arabia is quickly taken in a few months, and Iranians march towards Riyadh. At this point, Erdogan can intervene. Now that Iranians are no longer a player in Syria, Turks can easily full force take the country with drones. Rebel forces are only a few thousand. Damascus is secured in only a few weeks. Nearby, Jordan will be willing to grant Turks passage. They do not want their Saudi ally to become an Iranian puppet. Turks enter Hejaz promising aid to Saudis and pretending to be helping protect holy Islamic cities, but they will not declare war on Iran, like promised. Of course, in reality this is an occupation in disguise, and Turks should seize as much Saudi-owned American-made equipment as possible. Saudi king will not be happy that his Turkish enemies are intervening. But he is in no position to decline Turkish help, especially with the situation he is facing. Since Iranians are in control of the Gulf and majority of Saudi oil production, Saudi Arabia's oil exportation economy will collapse. Diversification efforts had been futile. Saudi nationals are lazy, having only to work 1 hour a day according to the government. While the mistreated and unhappy massive migrant population of South and Southeast Asians manage most of the heavy labor. With little experience of hardship, Saudis are barely going to be able to handle the economic collapse. Soon, it degenerates into civil war between tribal groups and creates an anarchic mess, just like most of Arabian Peninsula history. Saudi government desperately needs all the help they can get, even from Turkey. There will eventually be some diplomatic conference to sort out the issue. Erdogan should push for a Turkish UN mandate over Hejaz, claiming it's needed to protect holy cities of Mecca and Medina. If rejected, appease the EU by offering Lebanon to France. French-speaking Lebanese with colonial mentality probably want to be colonized by France anyways. Their kleptocracy is too unpopular. Undoubtedly, Iran will be sanctioned. However, like Russia's annexation of Crimea, it keeps its gains due to threat of continued blockade or US deglobalization, and promises oil exportations. Either that, or Iran is defeated and beaten back. Whatever the case, Turkey benefits, and Saudi Arabia is weakened. Nobody wants Saudi Arabia or Assad Syria back anyways. It would be hypocritical for the West, champion of human rights, to support governments who oppress their population and commits genocide on Yemenis or gasses their own population. China is happy to buy Iranian oil, while most Muslims view Saudi extremist Wahhabism as heretical to the teachings of Prophet Muhammad. Afterwards, Erdogan can clean up the Yemeni civil war, helping Iranian-backed Shia Houthis into power there, now possible with the collapse of Saudi Arabia. It's within Turkey's interest to prolong Saudi Arabia's collapse by selling weapons to all factions. From the Hejaz, if one faction becomes too powerful, cut aid in favor of supporting the other factions, until the balance of power is restored. Turkey now has control of Syria, Jordan, Hejaz and Yemen, as well as a substantial amount of Saudi equipment. Russia and Europe are likely still outraged at Erdogan's neo-Ottomanism. Europeans may ask to kick Turkey from NATO. Erdogan must deal with the EU first. Turkey is not strong enough to defeat Europeans, but it can cause as much instability as possible. From the fighting in Saudi Arabia, hundreds of thousands of refugees will try to flee to Europe. They will have to go through Turkey to reach Europe. EU does not want any more Muslim refugees. They will ask Erdogan to stop Arab refugees from crossing Bosphorus like they did with Syrians. Thus it will seem like Erdogan has leverage here. However, Erdogan opened the refugee floodgates at the start of 2020, and EU border patrol was able to prevent a huge amount of refugees from exiting Turkey. Therefore, even more refugees are needed to destabilize Europe. To do this, Turkey should turn to Ethiopia. In Ethiopia there is a civil war, mainly in the Tigray region. Turkey promises Ethiopia support against the Tigray rebellion. Ethiopians welcome any help they can get. Ethiopian army is weak, and somehow relies on Eritrea, a much smaller country, to contain Tigrays. Rebel forces are only a few thousand. Turkish drones can easily take care of the rebels in a few weeks like they did in western Libya and the 2020 Armenia-Azerbaijan war. In exchange for the support, Turkey receives a base in Ethiopian western Somalia, and strategically asks Ethiopia to dam the Nile faster. This will be detrimental to Egypt's survival. 95% of Egypt's water comes from the Nile, and a quarter of Egypt's population are farmers even more dependent on the Nile. Poverty rates have already been high in Egypt, subsequently made worse by lack of hydropower energy from Nile. Egypt has strongest military in Africa. But like all Arab armies, it is low on morale and run by kleptocrats. Egypt's kleptocracy will have no idea how to handle the situation, and even worse, Egypt's military has no power projection ability to attack Ethiopia. Once the Ethiopian dam is completed, Egypt's economy collapses. Millions of Egyptians will be displaced, unemployed, and dying of thirst. They will flee to Europe through Turkey. Erdogan is happy to let them go. European border patrol has done a good job of containing less than 1 million Syrians. But can it handle 20 to 40 million Egyptian refugees? Probably not. The crisis in Egypt will become an issue of the EU, a major identity crisis. When Merkel allowed Syrian refugees to enter the EU, there were major right-wing backlashes. And that was only with 400,000 Syrians. Now, the EU faces at least 50 times that amount of refugees. The refugees will steal Europeans' jobs and be persecuted. They will be blamed for the EU's economic issues by the secular law. In turn, the refugees will feel alienated and refuse to assimilate, instead turning to radical Islam. This already what's happening with Muslim minorities in France and Germany. Then, right-wing governments will retaliate. Right-wing governments are already on the rise in the EU, especially since Merkel is leaving power. Emmanuel Macron has started out a moderate, now people think he's Islamophobic. There's a reason why Islamo-leftists say Europe is always one refugee crisis away from a Fourth Reich. As right-wing Islamophobia rises, refugees become even more radicalized. It becomes a vicious cycle, and the EU will have to decide if Europe should become a bastion of multiculturalism or if Europe is for Europeans. Terrorist attacks will happen weekly in Europe. The EU has no choice but to beg Turkey to close refugee camps. But Erdogan's attention is still on Egypt. Now is the perfect time to seize Egypt. Its army will be malnourished from lack of water, and demoralized even further. Egypt is easily taken. Turkey can justify the intervention by declaring international shipping through the Suez Canal must be protected and undisturbed by Egyptian economic collapse. Israel should be offered a UN mandate over Sinai, under conditions of better treatment for Palestinians. Rest of Egypt under Turkish mandate. Any objections from NATO about Turkish interventionism will be unheard, since European NATO is distracted by the refugee crisis. And any conflict over Egypt will disturb the Suez Canal and destroy international trade. Nonetheless, Turkey must expand even faster if it wants to restore the Ottoman Empire before the UN asks Turkey to leave its mandates. Governments of other Muslim countries are worried about neo-Ottomanism too. But to the more uneducated Muslim commoners, Erdogan remains the most popular leader in the Islamic world, especially among Sunnis. By restoring peace, he is seen as the savior of Yemen, Arabia, Syria, and Egypt. In these countries, Turkey should grant Kemalist rights to the population, including women. Only Wahhabists, Assad loyalists, and radicals will oppose Erdogan now. To gain even more support from international Muslims, perhaps Erdogan can restore Islamic Caliphate by inviting the descendants of the last caliph over to the holy cities. Of course, he will be a Turkish puppet, a tool for Turkish influence over international Sunnis. Again, Muslim governments are worried at this, but Erdogan continues to act a staunch Kemalist, and the restoration will be a sign of hope for Muslims worldwide. Ever since the last caliph was deposed after World War I, the Islamic world had been in an existential crisis. Perhaps symbolically the return of the caliph can change that. After all, the Islamic concept of the Ummah means Muslims are more loyal to the faith than their nationality. This permits creation of large, partially pan-Islamic empires. So, from its new presence in Egypt, Turkey can continue empire building by deploying more drones to link up with Libyan government forces and defeat the opposition. Libya is now essentially a Turkish protectorate. Next, the same thing can be done in Sudan, helping the government fight rebels, this time in Darfur and the Blue Nile region. Then, from its base in Ethiopia, Turkey can again help another government crush rebels. In a few months, Somalian rebels, mainly from the Islamic State of Somalia, are no more. Somaliland is dissolved. Like Libya, Somalia is now another Turkish protectorate. Both depend on Turkish military support, house large pro-Turkish populations, and have economies already mostly controlled by Turkish firms. Turks enter Mogadishu, greeted as saviors. They now control both ends of the Red Sea. There will be protests from the UN. But secretly, everyone is relieved. Somali piracy is no more a threat to international trade. All these interventions can be done in less than a year. However, they will not solve Turkey's stagnating economy. To resolve that issue, Erdogan must look to Iraq's oil and backstab Iran. All irrigation societies depend heavily on rivers, and Iraq is no exception, specifically depending on the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers start in Turkey. They must be dammed up. Iraq will not want the same fate as Egypt. There will be another water war. And Iraq is now an Iranian puppet. Any conflict with Iraq will inevitably drag Iran in. Iraq and Iran eventually find an excuse to enter war with Turkey. Turkey should set up a defensive stance in its western borders. The mountains of Turkish Kurdistan are hard to cross. Turkish drones can inflict major casualties on the enemies like they did in the mountains of Nagorno-Karabakh. Erdogan may regain the full support of Turkish population. They see this as an invasion of the Turkish heartland and rally behind Erdogan. Iran has barely any air force, and Iraqi army is weak. Iranian ballistic missile force should immediately be countered with drones quickly. If necessary, Erdogan can invoke its NATO alliance, though that is probably unneeded. It's likely going to be a war of attrition in the mountains. But Iraqis will not be able to destroy the dam for years. Without control of the Tigris and Euphrates, Iraqis start to die of thirst. Morale breaks. The economy crashes. Famines rise. A powerful Turkish counter-offensive into Iraq can be easy. Erdogan just has to strategically deploy troops in Syria and invade from there, bypassing the mountains. Most of Iraqi land is flat, so Baghdad is reached in 41 days. Yemen, geographically isolated from Iran and still recovering from the war, is also occupied easily. Then, Turkish military swings north. Unfortunately, advancing into Iran will be much harder, as it's full of mountains too. At most, Turkey can occupy Iranian Azerbaijan or Flat Khuzestan, threatening Tehran. However, by this point, it's probably unnecessary. There may be a counter-revolution against the regime. Although it's still popular, support from the younger generation is slowly eroding, plus Iranians will suffer from years of sanctions, economic stagnation, and now static fighting in the mountains. And for what? Their government started a war with Turkey over Iraq. Turkey is not the aggressor like Saddam Hussein. Turks do not want to genocide Iranians. In World War II, the only reason Soviets were willing to fight for brutal Stalin was because Nazis wanted genocide. That was the difference from Russians who revolted against Tsar in 1917. In Iran's case, the situation resembles Russia in 1917 rather than Russia in 1941. Probably, a pro-republican Kemalist provisional force tries to topple the Islamist regime in Tehran. Khomeini commits suicide under his bunker. But conversely, regime change is probably impossible. Although Iran is multi-ethnic, there is a coherent civilizational identity in Iran, so most ethnicities will stay loyal to whatever government is in charge. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard is designed specifically to crack down on counter-revolutions. Plus, a stable and friendly Iran is within the interests of Russia, Pakistan, and China. Sanctions haven't done much either. Iran's economy is projected to grow this year despite Western sanctions. Regardless, the Iranian regime needs to make peace with Turkey to survive the inevitable republicans and ethnic uprisings, probably from Kurds or Baluchs. Thus, they will be willing to accept any of Erdogan's terms, similar to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Erdogan should demand an end to Iranian influence in the Levant and former Saudi Arabia. No reparation payments. but southern Azerbaijan will be ceded to Azerbaijan. In exchange, Turkey promises to sell arms to whatever government is in charge, since Erdogan does not want Russia to become powerful in Iran. Similarly, former Saudi Arabia is likely still in civil war if things are done right. It's still wise to prolong this conflict, so Turks won't have to evacuate Hejaz. Again, arms, including their own weapons previously seized by Turks, must be sold to both sides. If one faction becomes too powerful, support the others until the balance of power is stabilized. This will ensure Turkey has lasting influence in all Arabian factions, while Turkey gradually and quietly takes control of oil-rich Eastern Arabia. Turkey now has control of Iraq, Eastern Arabia, and Kuwait, all oil-rich regions. Kurds must be deported to those areas plus Libya, thus diminishing their demographic influence in Turkey proper, but no genocide. Going the other way from these territories to Turkey will be oil wealth and Syrian, Libyan, or Somali mercenaries who will find new jobs in Turkey's military now that war is over in their home countries. The oil money should not be wasted on kleptocrats and instead invested into infrastructure and development. With control of these regions, a significant amount of the world will come to depend on Turkish monopolized oil, while Turkish economy rebounds and grows. Ideally, new territories should be governed lightly, as in Ottoman times, but with Kemalist and Islamist reforms. Western or communist ideals must be kept down. An administrator from Turkey is installed to control the oil, otherwise the daily lives of subject peoples are not affected much. The West will be glad Iran and pro-Iranian Iraq are weakened, and in the process America starts selling weapons to Turkey again. But now they are also concerned with Turkey's monopoly on Middle Eastern oil exports, which Europe needs. Russia too, will be contentious with Turkey. Russia is already upset it lost influence to Turkey in Libya and Syria, and now Turkey and Russia are backing opposing factions in Iran. Defeating Russia was always difficult. But today's Russia is not the empire Napoleon and Hitler faced. Its western border ends near Belarus instead of Germany like in 1941. With NATO, containment of Russia can be achieved. It will start in Ukraine. Ukraine is not part of NATO. But it is an enemy of Russia, therefore an ally of Turkey. Start by conducting minor airstrikes on Russian defenses there. Then, deploy troops in Donbass and send the bulk of Turkish Navy to Sevastopol. Launch a sneak attack on Russian Black Sea Fleet there. Several ships are sunk. Over 3,000 Russian personnel dies. Putin sees this as a threat but also an opportunity. He can't allow Turkish airstrikes to decimate the Donbass, so he is happily forced to take action against Ukraine, which he needs to defeat anyway to secure Crimea's water supplies. Putin will send an ultimatum to Erdogan, probably demanding reparations for the attack on Crimea. Of course, Erdogan should refuse, saying Crimea is not a part of Russia, so there was no attack on Russian territory. Putin will respond with the mobilization of 200,000 troops near Ukraine. It will finish quickly because of the infrastructure built during the 100,000 men mobilization period weeks ago. Then, he invades Ukraine. But at this point, Turkey's goal is not to protect Ukraine. It's to force NATO into war with Russia. Russians will overrun Ukraine quickly if NATO doesn't intervene. NATO cannot allow a resurgence of Russian power, threatening the borders of several European countries. Biden has not been friendly with Russia recently either, hypocritically calling him a killer. Thus, Turkey should strategically withdraw its military from Ukraine, allowing Russians to threaten NATO more easily, in turn forcing NATO to Turkey's side and sell Turks even more weapons. Russians concentrate most of their army in Eastern Europe, steamrolling Ukraine. Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are bound to side with Russia in case of war. Belarus, in particular, will allow Russian army to link up with its base in Kaliningrad. After that, the Baltic states are isolated and easily occupied. No nukes will be used. Despite whatever Putin says, it's within no leader's interest to wipe out hundreds of millions. Chemical weapons were not used in World War II at all, so nukes will not be used here. In general, Russian military capabilities are unclear, but at most they can reach Berlin, and nothing after that. No matter what, Turkey should not get involved in the European. So to avoid suspicion over its absence from Eastern Europe, Turkey should commit to defeating the already crippled Russia Black Sea Fleet as well as bring the war to the Caucasus. There, with Azerbaijan, Armenia can be quickly overrun. It lost Nagorno-Karabakh in less than 2 months during fall 2020. Then, Erdogan sends an alliance request to Georgia. Georgia will accept. It sees the NATO-Russia war as an opportunity to regain Russian-backed South Ossetia and Abkhazia. With deployment of Turkish drones, Georgia's goal is achieved in months. However, advancing into the rest of Caucasus will be difficult, the mountains are freezing beyond Georgia. It will only be bypassed if Turkey can incite a Chechenian insurrection against the Russians, as they did in the 1990s or 2000s. In the European front, eventually Russians will become overstretched, perhaps in Poland and/or the Balkans. But it will only turn to stalemate because American commitment will be limited and incompetent under Biden. France and UK are Europe's only viable military powers. And Western Europeans are still dealing with the Egyptian refugees. Plus Europe is dependent on Russian gas and oil. Desperate, NATO will look to other fronts against Russia. Crimea is the most likely option. Russian Black Sea Fleet by now is annihilated. An invasion of Crimea will be possible, but of course amphibious invasions are difficult, and NATO will not be able to liberate the rest of Ukraine conventionally. At this point, there may be a world war. While NATO is distracted with Russia, China could use the opportunity to invade Taiwan. However, its economy depends too much on Middle Eastern oil now in Turkish monopoly. With a potential American naval blockade of the Malacca Strait, access to Middle Eastern oil is not guaranteed. And after the collapse of Iran, which was crucial to the Central and Western Asian Economic Corridor, China's Belt and Road Initiative is in shambles. Nonetheless, if Turkey can get China into the war, it will stretch the American military on multiple fronts. This is beneficial to Turkey because it means Russia will be able to hold against NATO longer, so both NATO and Russia, Turkey's rivals, are damaged more. Therefore Turkey should sign a secret neutrality pact with China, in exchange for the cancellation of China's Balkan Canal, which can potentially damage Turkish influence in the Balkans. And continue the Belt and Road Initiative by importing oil from neutral Pakistan into China. Or from Azerbaijan to China via the Caspian Sea and Central Asian Chinese-built high-speed railroads along the Eurasian Continental Land Bridge, bypassing any American naval blockade. Both Azerbaijan and Pakistan are strong allies with Turkey, and Pakistan has ties to China too. NATO will ignore this trade, it needs Turkey against Russia, while Central Asian countries are friendly with Turkey and Azerbaijan, and cutting off Pakistan from trade increases risk of hostilities. Russia will not dare interfere with the Caspian route either, for fear of alienating its crucial ally China. On the other hand, Turkey is free to fight Russia however it likes. The war will last for many years. But by the end of the war, both sides are exhausted and weakened, no matter who wins. And Turkey emerges virtually unscathed aside from a few occasional Russian airstrikes. It had managed to keep trade with both NATO and China, as well as occupying Crimea, Armenia, and Chechnya. Turkey can now begin the final phase of its expansion, the recovery of the Balkans. Because, after the war, Eastern Europe is economically and demographically shattered. Russian occupation or Russian bombings would have done severe damage to infrastructure in the region. Eastern European economies also had to suffer years without Chinese manufacturing or Russian gas and oil. Additionally, their population is already again and declining, made worse by industrial war. And all their major rivers flow through the Black Sea, with Turkish Bosphorus as the only outlet, meaning Turkey can monopolize a substantial part of the Balkans' import and export shipments. All this makes the Balkans ripe for Turkish reconquest. Western Europe will not be in much better shape. The refugee crisis would have been made even worse by the war. Perhaps some governments turn to neo-fascism or even leave the EU and NATO. But cut off from Russian oil for years, Europe becomes even more reliant on Turkish monopolized oil. As Turkey regains influence in the Balkans, Europe will raise sanctions. Turkey can respond by threatening to cut off Middle Eastern oil. However, if this strategy can't last forever, there will be a final war. Most likely between France and Turkey. Macron cannot allow Turkey to threaten the Balkans and control 30% of Europe's imported oil. France is Europe's top military power, and by far the most interventionist. Though France hasn't successfully transitioned into drone warfare unlike Turkey, it has a better army, navy, and air force. Yet, as of now, France seems to be in a catastrophic place. Protests have become more frequent. Issues on Islam and fascism divide the population. Veteran generals have already threatened to launch a coup against the French government, warning of a potential civil war in the country. Last month, France slid down in the democracy index, transitioning into a flawed democracy from a full democracy. And to top it all off, it's still dealing with Egyptian refugee crisis in this case, thus the Islam problem is a magnitude larger. Nonetheless, France has the support of Spain, Italy, and Greece. Germany has too many Turks, Poland has friendly relations with Turkey, and the USA does not want to be world police anymore, but they will slightly favor Macron. Macron's goals are simple: somehow invade Arabia and seize the oil fields. Two major fronts, one in the Mediterranean Sea and one in the Arabian Sea. Mediterranean will largely be under French control, especially since France has a powerful aircraft carrier. However, it doesn't have the same nearly unparalleled naval supremacy the US has. If Turkey can invade and heavily fortify Cyprus, control of the eastern Mediterranean will still be guaranteed. That's what the British did in World War II. The move will drive Greece towards France, but that's pretty much inevitable by this point. Greece has a decent navy and many islands. Turkish control of Aegean therefore isn't possible. Instead, Black Sea Fleet must be concentrated on the Bosphorus Straits, protecting Istanbul along with the mountains. Maintain defensive naval position in eastern Mediterranean too. That way, without control of the eastern Mediterranean, France will be forced to take the long route, via the African Cape to Arabia. It's a huge logistical feat, though possible due to French bases in African islands near Madagascar. An invasion force of 2 million men is probably assembled, but to reach Arabia, French Navy needs to go through two natural choke points in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. To prevent an invasion via the Persian Gulf, Turkey should appeal to the pro-Turkish Iranian government that depends on Turkey for weapons to blockade the Strait of Hormuz again. France also can't strike from the Gulf states, they are neutral. First phase of war starts with the preliminary invasion of Somalia, at the cost of 50,000 or so casualties. Then France invades Yemen, because all other routes are held by Turkish and Iranian naval blockade, or go through neutral territory, so Turkish-held Yemen is the only option. To make matters worse, upon landing, the French Legion faces a daunting task. Arabia's oil-producing regions are mostly in the northeast. French army will have to traverse a desert the same distance from Paris to Minsk, or Berlin to Moscow, in order to reach the oil. It's an extremely hot desert, and local tribesmen will be quite hostile. Peninsular Arabs do not like the Turks. But they hate the colonialist French atheists even more. In fact, almost all Muslims in the world hate France. Macron is essentially a symbol of Islamophobia and colonialism to them. As soon as the French army begins to advance across Arabia, Muslims worldwide fear they will attack the holy cities of Mecca and Median. Erdogan can capitalize on this fear by asking the Caliph to declare jihad on France. He should also incite uprisings against French neocolonialism in West Africa, whether jihadist or not. The implications are enormous. Muslims from all over the world, North Africa, Iran, Pakistan, Malaysia will flock to defend the holy cities from imperialism. France itself is also affected. The Turkish diaspora is generally more loyal to Erdogan than Turks at home, currently, and will gladly lobby for him. More violently, the radical Muslim minority, or probably majority by this point, will launch terrorist attacks every other day, similar to what happened during the Algerian War. Perhaps, the Eiffel Tower is destroyed by hijacked aircraft suicide bombers. French conservatives will be enraged. Others beg for an end to the war. So also like the Algerian War, the French population will be divided, while the Turks and Muslim allies are much more resolved by what they see as holy war. The military situation for France won't be much better. Turkish army evades battle and uses scorched earth tactics, forcing French to continually march across the desert for little gain. If the army even reaches Riyadh, it faces overheating, thirst, and supply line problems due to attacks by Arab tribesmen and Somali pirates, who would be rearmed by Turkey in this case there. Turkey can counterattack the exhausted army, forcing the French to conduct a Napoleon-like retreat. Only a few thousand French will be left when evacuation ships arrive. By now, Turkey can also easily overrun the French garrison in Lebanon. Greece is harder to invade, the terrain is quite rocky. France will probably strike in Libya next, though it won't be able to acquire the oil it needs there because of infrastructure problems. In response, Turks can threaten French influence in West Africa. Failing to seize 30% of Europe's oil needs, France's economy stagnates. Macron is pressured to end the war, both by other Europeans who need Middle Eastern oil, and internal strife among Muslims plus anti-imperialists. The war weakens Turkey's economy too, but it proves the West cannot break its dependence on Middle Eastern oil. And when all is said and done, Turkey still has that oil leverage. Even better, as a side effect of the Turkish blockade of the Eastern Mediterranean and Red Sea, Israel will starve and depend more and more on Turkey. Israeli nuclear threat can be countered by Turkey's own nuclear program, helped by its allies Pakistan and Iran. Soon enough, Israel's status is reduced to a client state of Turkey. Similarly, Turkey's program of expansion in the Balkans can continue, in much the same way China does in the Third World. Within years, the Balkans countries become de facto Turkish protectorates from a combination of debt trap diplomacy and oil dependency. Erdoğan's dream of the Ottoman Empire's revival is now essentially complete. For the first time in 100 years, the Middle East is at peace. No radical terrorists, no Wahhabists, no oil-hungry imperialists, no Shia Islamists, no Zionists. It's a remarkable time in history. Yet, this peace was the norm for most of the last 500 years too. The Ottomans kept everyone in check. But can this new peace last? Turkey's monopoly on oil, its strategic position in China's Belt and Road, and the Islamic concept of Ummah over nationality, suggests the answer is yes. Thanks for watching.